Oh.
And good evening, Stella and Jeremiah. Welcome to this Environmental Impact Symposium. In this session, we have 3 speakers, and 2 are from San Francisco, and they are at night time now, so I won't take too much of their time. Let me introduce the first speaker, Professor Stella Villaluz. She is a professor at the University of California, San Francisco School of Nursing, and she's been she has experience in tobacco control for over 30 years, and also co-author of the WHO report, Tobacco and Its Environmental Impact. And besides, she's an expert in the tobacco industry monitoring, and I think she is going to present today on a very interesting topic, so I'll let her go on. So welcome, Stella.
Thank you very much. Can I share my screen? I can't, so.
No?
Is there a way for me to share screen with everybody so I can? Oh, there we go. I'm allowed now. Thank you very much for whoever organized this, so I could share the screen. Thank you for inviting me to present. It is my pleasure. I wish I could be there in person, but such it is these days. Perhaps the next conference will be all together. I would like to acknowledge the funding for some of this work comes from the California Tobacco-Related Disease Research Program. It's a grant with my co-author, Jeremiah Mock, and I am happy to collaborate. So this is just the 2 of us and how we have been collaborating on these efforts to bring a little awareness on the issues of the environmental impact of tobacco. And one important thing to remember is that is the entire supply chain, the entire from all the way from the tobacco growing to the tobacco waste, which we're going to hear more about it. So, you know, we used to call it cradle to grave, beginning to end, has an environmental impact. I think there has been new attention to this issue. This is the WHO report that Narwit mentioned that we published in 2017, and a little more growing awareness that it really is important to address the environment impact of tobacco use. The tobacco industry, of course, has been doing their usual strategies and voluntary initiatives to prevent that, as in tobacco control pass strong policies and regulations. And that's what we really need. We need stronger policy solutions to address the environmental impact, and whenever possible, combine this within existing solutions or policies to, for example, the Framework Convention or the Sustainable Development Goals. In fact, the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, of which Thailand is a very significant party and has always played an important role, is specifically addressed the need for parties to address the environmental impact of tobacco cultivation and manufacture. And so we can go further and say also address tobacco waste. In addition to our Article 18 that I just mentioned of the FCTC, other articles of the Framework Convention important, Article 5.3 that reminds us not to establish partnerships with the tobacco industry. It also reminds us that we need it provides a regulatory framework that allow us to require that the tobacco industry disclose some of their environmental impact. It's called environmental impact. And so companies often do this for governments, and we could build that within tobacco control. And we need to remember that the industry should be accountable for the environmental harm it is causing. And the harms, like I said, are very widespread. And they go from tobacco growing to tobacco products manufacturing, to tobacco curing, to manufacturing, to packaging and distribution, to actual tobacco use, secondhand smoke pollution and third-hand smoke, to post-consumption waste. I will really talk mostly about the growing and the manufacturing and distribution, and my colleagues will talk more about post-consumer waste. So there are many harms of tobacco growing. Some of them are listed here. There's deforestation to clear land to grow tobacco in countries that are expanding their tobacco growing. The tobacco culture, it's very resource intensive, and it actually causes land degradation. So when people stop growing tobacco, many times they have to let that, give it a little time for that soil to recover. Because it's a monoculture, of course, there is a loss of biodiversity. It's a very intensive use of agrochemicals, which also pollute the environment and pollute the waterways. Excuse me, and there's some estimations that ending cultivation could free up enormous amounts of land that could be used to grow, for example, food. The manufacturing, supply, and distribution is another source of environmental harm from the tobacco, and that's a little more spread because there is, chemicals that are used to process the leaves, and we know there is all these chemicals that is also added to tobacco. There are also metals that are used in manufacturing. It's a lot of energy and water consumption in the process of leaf processing and manufacturing. A lot of manufacturing waste, right? And how does that get contaminated, and how does that contaminate waterways and soil? Emissions of carbon dioxide, and we have to remember that there's a lot of packaging. There's paper that is used both for the product and for packaging, and the distribution is in many, many countries is to trucks, which increase pollution. These are, like I said, briefly on post-consumption waste, because we're going to have a lot more on that. But we have to remember that cigarettes themselves are not natural products, and they contain thousands of toxic substances that eventually leach into the soil and into the waterways. We also have to remember that there is plastic and paper packages, and these are often non-biodegradable, as are the filters, which are not biodegradable. But there are some challenges. Do we know exactly the extent of the environmental impact of, for example, manufacturing and distribution, which I'm going to emphasize a bit more? We actually don't. There is really no standard for reporting. We have to rely on the tobacco companies, and we all know that relying on the voluntary information of tobacco companies is not a great idea. There has been really no recent updates. And what the industry has been doing is launching their corporate social responsibility or sustainability to claim that they are addressing the environmental impact, and this way trying to prevent more regulations and policies that would actually really address the impact. So I'm going to do a few examples of some initiatives and programs that the tobacco industry is doing as part of their corporate social initiatives. And most of them, this is not all of them, this is an example, but they do fund groups and create like cleanups. So let's do a cleanup on a beach and a park, and there is usually highly visible and get a lot of media attention. And again, so it's yet another way of marketing. If we remember, corporate social responsibility activities are marketing as per the Framework Convention. All of their statements on their websites now claim that they are reducing how much water they use, how much energy they use, how much plastic they use. But these are goals that they determine themselves, measure against themselves. There's no external verification, independent. They are trying to promote recycling programs for cigarette butts, and they love to distribute garbage cans and other receptacles where people can then throw their cigarettes, and this way they're preventing litter, they claim. So this is an example from the Philip Morris International webpage, and you see that in their 4 key priorities. One of them is protecting the environment. And if you click on that one a little more, you see that there is a range of activities from climate protection to waste reduction to, and that's manufacturing waste mostly, to littering prevention. And then if you go one step further to look what they're talking about, they actually created an entire website saying our world is not an ashtray, meaning let's prevent creating waste and garbage from tobacco products. And it's this beautiful website that if you scroll all the way now, there is like in small print that it is brought to you by Philip Morris International, but you have to really try to find it. So again, that's an example of voluntary initiative. British American Tobacco always have their initiative, and they're also claiming to be reducing their energy consumption, for example, and a lot of focus on tobacco growing. Japan Tobacco claims to be very serious about the environment. And similarly, it has different areas of activities such as water, reducing water waste, protecting the forests. And these are some of the initiatives that sometimes we see at the local level. So of course we see a lot of these beach cleanup programs that are sponsored by the tobacco companies. Here in the United States, there is a program called Keep American Beautiful that has been supported by the tobacco companies for decades. There is recycling programs, and this is an example of a recycling in a Japan tobacco manufacturing facility. Again, it's not recycling the tobacco product, it's recycling part of the things used during the manufacturing process in one facility. And there's, of course, those recycling support with what we find out what types of waste is acceptable. This is a program, again, here in the United States, where this company then, in theory, gets all these different products that they can recycle. But this is all voluntary and is not regulated, and we are very unclear on the if there's any positive impact. In fact, we think there is none. They also do, like I said, they distribute some garbage cans, usually in very visible areas, such as parks and beaches. But they don't do what really works, which is that reduce the source of environmental harm. So the tobacco companies could reduce the source by not producing tobacco, or by changing the way they produce tobacco, by eliminating all the chemicals, by eliminating filters, by not having some of these products anymore. These are real ways in which they could do that, and these voluntary initiatives are not it. There are some examples of local policy. San Francisco created an abatement fee, so the corporations have to pay the city a certain amount of money every year for paying for the cleanup. Again, it doesn't solve the problem, it just diminishes the cost of cleaning the problem. There's other cities and local level laws that are related to garbage. There are some consideration about bans on filters or ban the plastics, because of course there are plastics in cigarettes and other tobacco products. And there's many other civil society initiatives related to this local level, such as educating people about how harmful to the environment tobacco is. This is the FCTC, how they can address the harms of the tobacco chain, supply, and all the way from supply to consumption. And again, we have Article 18. That encourage countries to have policies to address the full tobacco production chain environmental harm. We got to remember that these industry programs, initiatives, there should be no partnership. And in fact, there should be a regulatory framework that require the reduction of these environmental impacts. We also need to consider that how can we hold the tobacco industry accountable for the environmental harm. So these are all policies that will be within the FCTC. For countries that like to use the M-Power to control the supply of tobacco products and implement the Framework Convention, we could apply the M-Power to the environmental harm. We could monitor tobacco waste and the activities of the tobacco industry, like I mentioned. We could, of course, continue to support 100% smoke-free environments, ban corporate social responsibility and marketing, which is considered advertising by the FCTC. Consider the environmental harm-related warnings. Could we have warnings on cigarette packs related to serious environmental harm, not warnings like they had in the 90s, says, please don't litter. These are not the type of warnings we're talking about here. But really talking about the harms that is causing and the impact. And we could consider implementing some sort of producer responsibility. How can we make the industry pay for this? But again, it has to be clear that this is not voluntary. The industry is providing some funding to do a cleanup. These are really holding the industry accountable and responsible for the environmental harms it's causing. In the minute that I have left, I want to mention the Sustainable Development Goals. They have a very strong link between tobacco control and the environmental protection. The tobacco industry, unfortunately, is already grabbing that framing and claiming them. And so it's an opportunity for us in tobacco control to make some outreach. So again, these are 4 key points. We need to address environmental harms. We need to reject those industry voluntaries. We need to continue partnering with civil society, particularly in environmental groups. And we need to start discussing the end game. Could we really change how the tobacco production cycle? Do we need it? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Stella. I apologize that I have not made it clear at the beginning about the Q&A session. So what would you prefer, Stella? Do you have anything else, or is it going to be a little too late for you if we save the Q&A until the end, or would you like to take questions?
That's perfect. We'll save it for later. Yes.
Okay.
This way everybody gets a chance to talk.
All right,
yes.
Good. So then I'd like to go on to the next speaker then, huh? Our next speaker is Dr. Jeremiah Mark. Dr. Jeremiah Mark is the Associate Professor at the University of California, San Francisco School of Nursing as well. And he has been in tobacco control work for about 23 years of experience, focusing on the tobacco and culture. And he is also a principal investigator of the policy research to denormalize tobacco use in the great outdoors in California, Japan, and Thailand. And I think he'll show us about the very interesting topics today. So please, Dr. Mark.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for having me. I'm delighted that we could put this symposium together. I would like to share my screen. And then I'll... So, greetings from California. I live in Marin County, just north of San Francisco. This is our beautiful California coastline, and look forward to welcoming you all to come and visit us sometime. So, this is the presentation that I'll be talking about today, which is environmental impacts of tobacco supply and use. And I want to emphasize the supply as well as use at parks and beaches in California, Japan, and Thailand. And this is the list of my wonderful group of collaborators on this, and where we're from, the different organizations in California, Japan, and Thailand. And so as Ajahn Naurat mentioned, this project really focuses on policy research to denormalize tobacco use in the great outdoors. And when we talk about denormalizing, we're talking about changing the cultural norms, the way that people think about using these kind of products, where they are appropriate to use or not appropriate, and getting to a place where people realize that it's not appropriate to use these kinds of tobacco products anywhere in the outdoors, particularly at parks and beaches. So, of course, our world is a beautiful place, and it's our only home, and it turns out that it is every year littered with somewhere between 3 and 4 trillion cigarette butts. And this is a serious problem, and it's contaminated with toxic air pollution from the use of products. So we got together as a group to start to think about how we could look in an international collaborative way at the issue of tobacco use in outdoor areas. And I got started in this because I love the beach, and my family and I enjoy going to the beach in California and other places. And as we've gone to enjoy the beach, we have often found that unfortunately there are people out there who are smoking, and the smoke drifts and really spoils our experience of breathing fresh air. And of course, it exposes us to the toxins that are in the air. Many people do not realize that the U.S. Surgeon General's 2006 report found that there's sufficient evidence to conclude that there is absolutely no safe level of exposure to secondhand smoke, even in the outdoors. The United States Environmental Protection Agency has said that regardless of where the exposure takes place, outside or inside, secondhand smoke poses health risks to children. And people often don't think about that. They also don't think about the consequences of flicking cigarette butts onto the ground or putting them in the sand. And this results in an accumulation of toxic waste. So coming back to what Stella mentioned, the U.S. tobacco industry knows that it has a dirty little problem. Keep America Beautiful, which was actually co-founded by Philip Morris, estimated that in the United States, the litter cleanup costs run in the range of $11 billion annually. And this is probably a substantial low-end estimate. So in California since 1955, when this cigarette filter was really introduced, I'll ask you to think and guess how many cigarette butts have been disposed of. So I did a calculation, and I came to the conclusion that it's at least 450 trillion butts. That's about 23 Olympic swimming pools worth of cigarette butts that have been disposed of just in our environment in California. And they are 2-centimeter long toxic waste dumps. So what do I mean by that? Well, let's look at the scale of the problem first. California Coastal Commission sponsors cleanups, and the most recent data that they have between 1989 and 2014, the cleanups picked up about 6.9 million butts off of the beaches. And remember that this is only a fraction of what's actually disposed of, because they're hard to find and they get buried in the ground and so forth. Globally, cigarette butts make up typically about 40% of the total debris items that are collected. Last year, the collections yielded about 1.8 million cigarette butts. And cigarettes are a known source of structural fires and wildfires, which, as you probably have seen in the news, is a very serious concern for us here in California. So the really toxic tobacco product waste, that includes all the waste items that are used for consuming tobacco and nicotine. Cigarette butts themselves, as Stella mentioned, contain about 7,000 different chemicals, over 200 of which are known carcinogens. The waste also contains toxic metals that leach out, including arsenic, lead, cobalt, and cadmium. Butts are made of plastic, and most people that I've spoken with and interviewed don't realize that. The plastic is called cellulose acetate. The butts, therefore, are really not biodegradable. They just break down into microplastics. And the plastic packaging becomes waste. The lighters contain toxic chemicals. And this is the result, that in fact, we end up with a problem of nicotine toxicity and environmental contamination. So nicotine itself is an environmental toxin that damages nerve tissues. It's a U.S. Environmental Protection Agency regulated acute toxic hazardous waste substance. So insects in particular are very sensitive to nicotine in the environment, and especially the pollinators like honeybees and butterflies. And nicotine was used and still is used in some places as a pesticide. Aquatic life is affected as well. Nicotine is toxic to aquatic organisms, including small freshwater and saltwater fish and small crustaceans. And there are studies, over 100 in animal models, demonstrating that it's neurotoxic to vertebrates, particularly rodents, and they're part of the important part of the food chain. One of the biggest problems with this issue is that cigarette butts are really invisible in plain sight. We just don't see them. And even if they're under our feet, we don't see them. And now we have another problem, which is the relatively recent player in the tobacco market, which is the electronic cigarettes, and in particular Juul, who have told the consumers that the products are simple, satisfying, and clean, and that they give a user freedom from smoke, ash, and odor. But what about a freedom from the toxic waste that they produce? So this is a teardown of what the device looks like. And as you can see, it's e-waste, electronic waste, and particularly have lithium-ion batteries that, as you probably know from flying, can spontaneously cause fires, along with all of the other components. The pods, when you break them down, have a range of plastic components, and then they also contain residues of the nicotine salts and flavorants, some of which are known to be carcinogenic. So this is what a Juul pod looks like when you find it on the ground after somebody's disposed of it. And they eventually break apart. If they have residue in them, then over time that residue escapes and enters into the environment. This is what the natural history, if you will, looks like of the pods from the time that they're relatively new until they've degraded and they're on their way to becoming microplastics. We have an even newer comer to the vaping space, as it's called, and those are the products that are marketed to be disposable. They're single-use devices like the puff bar, which again have all of these components and the residues in them, and people just use them once and they don't refill them. They just throw them wherever they do, and we find them on the ground as they're on their way to being crushed up and releasing the toxic nicotine into the environment. So let's step back to the beach and the coastline and think about what is the cause of this idea that it's okay to smoke in the great outdoors, and what causes people to feel that they can just flick cigarette butts on the ground or in the sand. Well, you're probably not surprised. It's really the tobacco industry. So these are old ads from the late 1930s, actually, promoting the idea of smoking in the great outdoors. And we've collected thousands, literally thousands of ads going back even further than this until now. This theme of smoking in the great outdoors has been a persistent one that the tobacco industry has pushed for decades and decades and decades. Encouraging people when they're out camping to smoke, or if they're at the coast, that the idea that it's cool to smoke and it's refreshing to smoke, and it's fun to enjoy the pleasure of being with your friends and smoke. All right, I'd like to tell you a little bit about parks and beaches in California. So we have a huge park system, 280 state parks, and a large number of campsites and long coastline. Each year, the state parks have about 67 million visitors to all the different types of properties. There are millions of people who visit California's 34 national parks, and then the counties operate regional parks, and many have beaches because of our long coastline. Along just the 220 miles of Southern California coastline alone, each year there are an estimated 129 million beach visits. So these are all moments when people can potentially be exposed to secondhand smoke and the disagreeable odor of smoke, and see people putting cigarette butts into the ground. So these green dots represent all of the properties in the California State Park system. And I should tell you that California, about 2 years ago, passed a law banning smoking in state parks and state beaches. It's one of the first states in the United States to do so. We are still in the early phases of the implementation of this new policy. I want to tell you a little bit about what we found doing field work up in Mount Tamalpais State Park, which is close to where I live. We have signage out because of a fire hazard. Unfortunately, though, we do find people that just don't pay attention and flick their butts on the ground. If you go just very close to the bay here by where I live, this is a state park that is a historical treasure. It's the last Chinese shrimping village along the San Francisco Bay. And we find things like this where there are picnic tables and people jamming smoldering cigarette butts that are obviously a fire hazard. If you go up into the Sierra foothills, you'll find historic buildings, and then you'll see that in the fire pits, people have a tendency to use them like ashtrays. And of course, these, when rain falls in them, that leach out the chemicals that are in the cigarette butts. And unfortunately, we also are finding jewel waste in these parks as well. If we head down to the Southern California coast, we find people flicking cigarette butts at scenic points, and they make their way into the storm drains, which drain out into the ocean. We find, again, these jewel pods that are degraded. And this all, collecting and picking this waste up costs the state a tremendous amount of money in person power, and they're a nuisance to pick up. They're very time consuming, and it's difficult to find them. So this just gives you a kind of sense of the distribution of these items in different parts of this particular park. And we think that one important strategy is to use this kind of interpretive signage to educate the public, just as we've done about not collecting marine wildlife, marine animals from the coast, to also teach them about the effects of tobacco product waste on important organisms that are in the ecosystems. So I want to shift to Japan and talk a little bit about the parks in Japan. We went to Kobe in particular, which is a progressive policy banning smoking on the beaches. And as you can see, unfortunately, there are people that ignore the signage, but they've made a substantial effort to educate the public. We do find cigarette butts out there. And then we find these, which you probably don't recognize unless you're from Japan. This is a cartridge that has tobacco inside of it that is used in a heated tobacco product manufactured by Japan Tobacco called Plume Tech. Japan is a very big market globally for IQOS, which is a heated tobacco product. And this product has recently been approved for use in the United States as well. And this is the kind of marketing strategy they use. To attract young people, very high-tech, beautiful colors, great design, lots of flavors. But these devices actually are e-waste, and they also have these nasty heat sticks that have nicotine and other toxic chemicals in them. They're obviously going after the young generation, so not surprisingly, when we go out to the beach, we see people enjoying the day at the beach, and unfortunately, we also see them enjoying these kind of products and flicking them on the ground. So we find these toxic heat sticks as well. And this is what they look like with scorched compressed tobacco, and then We have plastic components. This is what the waste looks like when we do a collection. We've been to Thailand, working with Ajahn Nawarat, at the parks to do collections there. We find some evidence of enforcement of Thailand's national law prohibiting smoking in parks and some creative signage to educate the public about the environmental contamination. In places like Khao Yai, unfortunately, the signage is not as good, so there's work to be done there. And we unfortunately do find people that are still out smoking even while we're trying to pick up the butts. This is what the coastline looks like in Thailand. It's a very busy place. Ajahn Nawarat's going to tell you about that. And Thailand has been very forward-leaning now in banning smoking at popular parks and beaches. And we hope to create a global network, starting with the Pacific Rim, to expand the work, and we invite you to join us so that we can get rid of smoking at the beaches. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
I'll stop sharing now.
Thank you, both of you, Stella and Jeremiah, for your very interesting presentations. And I think it's time that we should have smoke-free beaches around the world. And now, when your project ends, at least we will have in 3 countries, no, Jeremiah?
I hope so.
So the last presentation for this session, the Environmental Impact Symposium, will be by myself. And how do I show this one? Slide. Okay. Oops. No. I'm sorry. Okay. Yeah. Here's my title, but first of all, I'd like to introduce myself briefly. My name is Nawarat Charanka. I've been working at the Faculty of Public Health, Mahidol University, for almost 30 years, and I've been involved with research in tobacco control for about 25 years, that mainly focusing on secondhand smoke and tobacco industry interference. And I've been working closely with the TRC, Tobacco Control Research and Knowledge Management Center. So my topic today is the tobacco product waste at the 2 popular beaches in Thailand. The follow-up after a smoking ban that sparked action against smoking. It's a part of the project that Jeremiah mentioned earlier, that we are trying to do something in these 3 countries, the U.S., Japan, and Thailand. So we've been going around collecting samples together quite a lot last year, but unfortunately it has not been possible in the past year and up until now because of COVID situation. So Jeremiah talked a lot about this one already, that worldwide cigarette butts are the #1 trash item collected in most beach cleanups. And you can see that it's mixed well, in the dirt, in the sand there, and sometimes can hardly see. So people kind of ignore it, when you go to the beach, because it's so tiny, so small, and just taking it like a normal piece of item in your daily life when you go to the beach. But in fact, the environmental contamination is, invisible, as the butts break down and releasing plastic fibers that you have already seen in detail from Jeremiah's presentation earlier, that releases a lot of toxic tobacco chemicals, and also, harming the environment, including food chain, animals, and marine life, and so on. So the pollution from tobacco product waste, or TPW, contains toxic substances that can harm, many lives, marine ecosystems like what we see in this slides here. Not just cigarette butts that we found on the beach. You see cigarette packs and lighters and many things when we go around to collect the samples. So in our study, the methods that we use for the fieldwork in Thailand as a part of this 3-country study is that we collect and count of the butts and other TPW items. Then we sieved sand and counts of the butts in the sand, a measurement of secondhand smoke generated by the beachgoers, and then we calculate smoker density in the beach areas. This is a picture of sieving sand, the sieved sand sampling that was conducted at 10 locations on each beach when we go around, because lots of times the cigarette butts are buried, deep in the sand, so you kind of have to sieve the sand in order to get some butt samples. So the summary of the findings of from our fieldwork in 2017, we collected on the average of 523 butts per hour over several hours on the 2 beaches, and the sieved sand counts on 11 beaches averaged 2.26 butts per square meter, and secondhand smoke that we measured using the side pack machine with the peak levels of P2.5 measured at the point source near smokers reached as high as 1,333 micrograms per cubic meter. A smoker density averaged of about 50 smokers over 250 meters of the beachfront. So the references in our published paper down below. And our findings from the fieldwork 2 years later in 2019, we collected the average of a very close number, about 520 butts per hour over several hours on 2 beaches. The sieved sand counts on 1 beach averaged of 3.8 butts per square meter, and on another beach a lot higher at about 8.6 butts per square meter. The collection at the locations of high smoker density and the beach raking practices increased these levels well above findings from the 2 years prior to that. So this was a little disappointing because smoking ban had been in effect since 2017. But in practice, if you attend my session yesterday, some youth raised this point in many other low and middle income countries. It's just the same. Some countries have very, very strong laws, but enforcements are very weak. So I think we really have to count on the next generation to come up with some kind of measures to how to control that. So during our fieldwork, the officials from the municipality and volunteer, the beach security and lifeguard group, they were very interested in what we are doing and then learning about our research. So they came to learn about what we're doing. And then that stimulated them, with our encouragement. The volunteer beach security and the lifeguard group, they increased their efforts to educate the people who go to the beach about keeping the beach smoke-free. So they have this campaign from time to time. And the leader, the one who was with the microphone. Very strong leadership that when he saw us doing this, he really just came, approached us and learned about how we're doing. So they organize volunteers weekly to clean up the beach, with the university students and NGOs. And more activities are planned once post-COVID gatherings are permitted. But right now, when you go to those beaches, it's almost empty. So lesson learned from our seep sand counts. The seep sand fieldwork revealed that maintenance personnel were raking butts and other plastic items and fragments near the shoreline. When we collected some older butts along the shoreline, it shows that the tide were recirculating butts along the shore, like that's you saw in the earlier slide. And there you see someone smoking at the beach. In some parts of the beach, we noticed that there are no smoking signs, posted on these coconut trees too. But at this one, there is no sign. So how we are going to eliminate the tobacco product waste? The popular beaches need continuous attention because local authorities report that the people who go to the beach do not understand the environmental cost of the tobacco product waste. They've seen that in all their life. When you go to the beach, it's just a very normal practice. People smoke and then just throw the cigarette butts all over. It's just like the natural ashtray because full of sand. So it will just disappear under the sand, right? So I like the idea of this leader. He told us that the punishment that when he found some violators, he just go to talk to them, give them education first, what kind of impact it's going to do to the environment. And when they understand that, he will make them, the smoker, go around, pick the cigarette butts. Sometimes he said 30 butts or 50 butts. It depends on how, he would punish them. So this is a good enforcement strategy, to engage the smokers to clean up the butts so that they see the environmental contamination up close and they realize how much work it takes to clean up the tobacco product waste. But when they smoke, they don't realize that, right? They just do it naturally, So the future opportunities for improving environmental quality on Thailand's beaches would be that working with the beach authorities and volunteer groups. So we hope to enlist the beach workers to monitor the butt counts and map locations with high smoker density and devise mechanisms to reduce and remove the tobacco product waste. And since the environmental conditions both on land and from currents on the coast vary, we feel that it's important to enlist those who work to protect marine ecosystem in eliminating tobacco waste, tobacco product waste. So I like this picture. The guy on the right is he has a very strong leadership. Even until now, we exchange a message online. He always show us what's going on the beach. And so this is just my concluding slide. Together we will eliminate smoking on the beach. You can see many happy faces when there's no smoking on the beach. So I think we have a few minutes for questions. Thank you for your attention for all of our presentations in this symposium. Any questions from the audience? I don't think I get any. No? No questions? All right. Well,
I'd just like to put a question out there. I don't know, we can't really see how many people are attending, but Janna, right in front of you, do you have a live audience there with you?
no, we have just some technicians. And
Oh, yeah.
there's one person, Dr. Stephen Harmon, is watching us
Oh,
here.
yeah, our team member. And well, I just put it out to the attendees, and we really thank you for taking the time and for your interest in this topic. And I wonder if anybody could share with us things that they have been doing on this issue in their own home countries. We would be very interested to know about what kind of work you've been doing. I guess they would have to go through the chat. Is that the way, or I don't know how it would work.
Steve just brought it up that yesterday we had a workshop with youth from 11 countries. There were almost 80 youth, attending our session yesterday all day, and they have been very active. And I think they realize the problems, and they have very strong leadership that we have some, good hope on what they will be doing in the future for the environment.
Did they talk at all about the secondhand smoke exposure issue in the outdoors? Because a lot of times people don't realize how serious that can be.
Steve wants to add something.
Yeah?
Okay. And in the workshop for youth, Navarat made a presentation in which he talked about the problem of secondhand smoke, and some of them did mention something about it in terms of what they might do to try to work on this area. We didn't really have time to go into specifics about it, but at least they are well aware that there's a problem with enforcement and that you can't just have a law, you have to have compliance with the law.
Yeah. I think one of the things, Steve, that is important for people to keep in mind is that smoking at the beach has consequences for people in our society who are particularly sensitive to exposure to secondhand smoke. That people who have asthma, small children, families with small children, pregnant women, older people, people with respiratory conditions. So a lot of times we hear this discussion about, well, it's just the outdoors and it's not really a problem. So much emphasis, of course, in California and other places has been put on banning smoking in indoor spaces, and that's sort of pushed people out into these outdoor spaces as kind of what we could call the last frontier for tobacco control, the last sort of safe space. But in fact, when people are smoking in these kind of outdoor spaces like parks and beaches, what they're doing really is contaminating the air and making it difficult or impossible for people who are sensitive to secondhand smoke to be able to go and enjoy those spaces. So there's an unfortunate infringement on the right of people to be able to breathe fresh air. And I think the same thing goes when we're talking about tobacco product waste as well. that people don't realize that the small children can pick up cigarette butts and eat them, and that they're toxic and can send them to the hospital. And they don't realize that they flick their butts, you know, and if they ignite a wildfire, that has enormous effect for the public, you know, that is in the surrounding areas. So these are all issues that I think people in tobacco control can focus on and try to raise public awareness about.
That is very good point, Jeremiah. Thank you so much. I think we are kind of running out of time, and
Okay.
so Stella, you want to add any final words, or it's kind of late for both of you there? So with that, I'd like to call this to a close, and thank you so much, Stella and Jeremiah, and also Steve, for your input. So we have very nice symposium. So thank you. Thank you, the audience.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you to the organizers as well for everything, for all the technical work. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Good night, Stella.
Okay.
Good night, Jeremiah. Bye-bye.
Good night. Good night.
Bye.
สวัสดีครับ
สวัสดีค่ะ